Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this next session. It's a very great pleasure to introduce my friend and fellow conversant, Craig Keener, who is a marvelous theologian and a marvelous historian of theology, a marvelous commentator on the New Testament. As you can see from the great display behind me, Craig is an aficionado of miracles. He has collated and collected evidence about miracles from around the world. He has first-hand, second-hand, third-hand reports of miracles, and he has developed thinking about how we can identify and differentiate and distinguish miracles. Craig is a man of conscience as well as conscientiousness. Everyone who has seen his 4-volume commentary on the book of Acts, which is a monumental work, or other commentaries that Craig has written, will know how the conscientiousness and the consciousness of a real scholar works. Craig works long into the night and has read probably everything and is able to bring all that learning and wisdom to bear. There's already been reference made to the way that Craig Keener annotates his work. I think in part that's a product of the fact that Craig, like many a man of conscience, swims against the tide. And therefore, he needs to document, he needs to armor. People who take the trouble to read his work will have a very difficult time arguing against him. Their easy strategy is to set it aside and not read it. But if they read it, and if they go to the footnotes, they'll have to see that his learning, both in the classical sources and in the theological sources and in the scriptural sources, the historical sources, and the anthropological sources, is without match in the world that we live in. He sets a standard which we all could emulate and profit from. He's a good example of someone who has taken a problem and turned it into an opportunity. His problem being the credibility for someone who is swimming against the tide, and the advantage that he has made of it is the marvelous suit of armor which does not impede his mobility and his creativity at all. It's a really great pleasure to welcome Craig Keener to this session of the conference. The commentator in this session will be another good friend of mine, Tim McGrew, whom we've already heard from a little bit, and who at this point does not need introduction. Another learned and versatile man. We've seen the display of his learning and versatility already today and yesterday. Craig Keener, please welcome.
I think that's the nicest introduction I've ever had, and now I'm embarrassed because of my presentation is not up to that level. But anyway, I seem to have developed a head cold, which seems to have happened the last 4 out of 5 times I've spoken on the subject. Is that coincidence? Is it special divine action? Or do I need to deal with my immune system before I travel? I don't know. Anyway, we're talking about the question of miracles, their plausibility in the Gospels and Acts. And my point is not to try to demonstrate special divine action. I believe in special divine action. I believe in general divine action. And I leave it to the philosophers and the theologians to figure out where on the continuum different things lie. But that's not my point here. My point here is to challenge the idea that reports about Jesus that are often explained as miracles are historically implausible. The book is like 1,100 pages long, and they only gave me 6 hours, so I had to narrow it down. And Andrew is not smiling. Anyway, David Friedrich Strauss really brought some of Hume's idea into New Testament scholarship, and his argument was actually more plausible than the argument of some of his predecessors who were saying, well, we don't believe in miracles, so when Jesus walked on water, he just knew where the rocks were or something. Strauss said, no, these are better explained as legends that developed over generations of time. But Strauss had a problem with his approach. There was a German Lutheran pastor by the name of Johann Christoph Blumhardt who often prayed for the sick, and dramatic recoveries are reported during that time, actually from people's journals and letters, documented pretty much firsthand from that period. Strauss had a friend named Edward Morica, and according to both his reports and Morica's reports, Morica could walk only with difficulty. It was attributed to weakness in his backbone, but after he'd spent some time with Johann Christoph Blumhardt, he got better, he was able to go hiking in the mountains, and Strauss explained this recovery as psychosomatic. However, what Strauss did not do was to claim that his friend's recovery was merely a legend that developed over several generations. Strauss followed Hume's principle of uniformity, that the past is not different from today, which has been adopted by many historians, Ernst Troeltsch, and so forth. The problem with seeing the Gospels that way is that all of our earliest evidence supports Jesus as a healer. Mark, which comes from about a generation after Jesus' ministry, usually dated about 40 years later, it takes the form of an ancient biography, as the majority of scholars now recognize. And I've done a lot of work in ancient biographies, and normally ancient biographies, especially about a character who lived that recently, are substantially historically accurate. When I say substantially, I don't mean every detail, but I mean the events that they report are events that they're getting from their sources. They're not simply making them up. It's quite different from a novel. Q, which there's not absolutely consensus on this, but for the majority of scholars still hold there's another source besides Mark that's shared in common by Matthew and Luke. This also reports miracles. Other early Christian sources do. Josephus in Antiquities, Book 18, reports Jesus as a miracle worker, according to the most likely interpretation of that, which has been argued. It's the most common interpretation. It's also, but it's I think been argued most forcefully by Geza Vermes, who taught here. Detractors of the early Christian movement also acknowledged that Jesus was known as a miracle worker and that some of his followers were known as miracle workers as well. The principle of analogy that historically had been used against saying, well, we don't see miracles today, so we can't expect that we would see them in the Gospels. The principle of analogy today has been turned on its head by a number of scholars to say, actually, this can support healings in the Gospels. And so this is going to be my focus in this presentation. The point is not what proportion of these claims involve divine activity or miracles. The point is whether Hume or Strauss can legitimately start from the premise that uniform human experience excludes spontaneous healings in theistic contexts, or even a large accumulation of such spontaneous healings in such contexts. How widespread are healing claims? Well, if I start with churches known for that emphasis, there have been major academic studies in recent years, published by Oxford, Cambridge, and others. Global Pentecostal and Charismatic Healing, edited by Candy Gunther Brown, published by Oxford in 2011, is a major example. In the 2006 Pew Forum survey of Pentecostals and Charismatics in just 10 countries. Now, it's been estimated that Pentecostals and Charismatics may be 500 million people. It's kind of a disparate group when you look at who's included in that. But in any case, the survey was conducted in just 10 countries. And in those 10 countries, for Pentecostals and Protestant charismatics in these 10 countries alone, the estimated total, extrapolating from this survey based on the percentages and the numbers, The estimated total of these people claiming to have witnessed divine healings comes out to somewhere around 200 million people. Now, you don't have to agree that those were all miracles. In fact, I don't think anybody would say all of those are miracles, no matter what we believe about divine healing. But to say that we can simply start from the premise that nobody claims, or we have no credible witnesses for these things, as Hume seems to have done, seems to me to be an untenable premise at this point. And that's not including even the Catholic charismatics. I don't know why the survey focused just on Protestants. But in any case, more surprising in the survey was other Christians. Somewhere around 39% in these countries claimed to have witnessed divine healing. So we're talking about a huge number of people. Even in some Western countries, although, as you know, in the West it's less, there's less openness to this in some Western countries, but in the United States, 34% of people claim to have witnessed or experienced divine or supernatural healing. And that's not just limited to Christians, it's more widespread than that. Healing claims are not limited to Christian movements, but I had better access for research in Christian movements, so I summarized some of those in my book and then went on to the Christian movements for which I have better access. But claims of Christian healing are not limited to those starting with Christian assumptions. In Christian contexts, often most dramatically, the most dramatic accounts that we find are in circumstances most like the accounts about Jesus and his first apostles, previously unexposed areas being exposed to Jesus' message. China was not in the 10 countries mentioned above, but a report from about around the year 2000 from the official China Christian Council suggested that half of the new conversions of the previous 20 years have been caused by what they called faith healing experiences. Now, that's probably millions of people. Less conservatively, according to some surveys, 90% in the rural areas, in the house church movement, cited healing as a reason for their conversion. Now, there's no way I can verify, it's 50% or 90%, but whatever the percentage is, we're talking about a lot of people who didn't start with Christian premises, but were persuaded that they had experienced something so out of the ordinary from their normal experience that they were willing to change centuries of ancestral traditions based on this experience. We have many reports of this in India, of people becoming Christians as a result of this. A survey from 1981 suggested that 10% of non-Christians in Chennai had been healed through prayer in the name of Jesus, those who answered the survey, and 30% were aware of that happening. Now, I know that there can be biases in who answers surveys and so on, but in any case, it's a lot of people. One example, this one is from North India. One of my students, Pastor Israel, his church grew from a handful of people to about 600, mostly from non-Christian backgrounds, based on this. And I found out about this actually because one day I had a severe headache, and in the very room where this picture was taken, he asked me how I was doing. I said, I have a headache. He said, oh, brother, let me pray for you. And he prayed for me, and nothing happened. I mean, the headache has since gone away, but nothing happened. And he said, how do you feel? I said, I still have a headache. I said, it's because I don't have any faith. He said, no, brother, it doesn't work here. Well, we discussed that more about why that might be, but that's another story. So there was a people movement in Nickerie, Suriname, starting in November 1994. And one of the people who witnessed the precipitating event is the one who shared this with me. It was in his dissertation, and then I interviewed him about it. But they had only, he told me that he thought they'd only had like a couple hundred Christians among this particular group of people, even though they had been talking about, people had been talking about Christianity for centuries. And there was this man who came, and he was defying them. He said, I defy this Christian God. His arm had been paralyzed for like 70 years. And suddenly his arm shot up in the air, and he looked at it, and the people around him looked at it, and he was converted, and so were the people around him. Now you can say, well, nobody prayed for him, so it's not really a theistic context. I don't know, but in any case, the way it was experienced by the people there. In the 1990s, following that, the churches had tens of thousands of new people join the churches, and that's well documented. This fits a pattern that occurred in some other times in history too. In fact, Yale historian Ramsay MacMullen has pointed out that in the 300s and 400s, the leading cause of conversion to Christianity had to do with exorcisms and healings. There are a number of medical sources. I'm just giving some samples here. But Dr. Rex Gardner has a popular book called Healing Miracles. He has, it's a little bit more technical in an article that he wrote for the British Medical Journal. But he gives a number of examples. One of the examples he gives is of a 9-year-old girl. She had just been tested again by her audiologist, and she was completely deaf without her hearing aid. But she was praying for healing. And so she was praying. Suddenly she could hear, and her parents called the audiologist. He said, "That's impossible. This is auditory nerve damage. That doesn't just go away." But in fact, the next day the tests proved that her hearing was normal. Usually you can't get documentation like this because usually your insurance company won't let you go back and get another test that fast. But in any case, there are eyewitnesses, some of whom I know, excuse me, who report the healings of deaf non-Christians in Jesus' name in Mozambique. Completely non-Christian villages with no churches. And then, the next day they started church there. There are people that I talked with who witnessed some of this where actually they would just start preaching and people were spontaneously, who had no experience of this before, spontaneously they could see or they could hear. Some of this was documented by a team who published their results in Southern Medical Journal in September of 2010. Critics' response was that the testing conditions were not very good, which is actually a legitimate response because it's really hard to get ideal testing conditions in rural Mozambique. But if you read the response of one of the work's authors, Candy Gunther Brown, in her work Testing Prayer, published by Harvard University Press in 2012, she goes into some detail on what the circumstances were. And at least I think anybody who reads that would be convinced that something really dramatic did take place. The Catholic Church has been particularly scrupulous about collecting medical documentation. Lourdes, I hope I'm saying that right. My wife is Francophone and she always makes fun of my French, but Lourdes has been particularly scrupulous, particularly rigorous about it, and also in the process of collecting miracle accounts regarding saints and so on. Jacqueline Duffin's book with Oxford talks more about the history of that. Another case, this one is of somebody named Lisa Larios. She had a degenerative disease. She wasn't able to walk. She didn't know that she was dying because her parents hadn't told her that. But she went to a healing crusade, whatever we may think of that. But she went to this healing crusade, but nobody actually prayed for her. Just during the crusade, while she was watching other people, suddenly she jumped out of her seat. She ran around, and the testing afterward, the x-rays showed that not only was she better, but the degeneration of her bones had undegenerated, if I can coin a new word. There are other reports from other doctors of different kinds of experiences. One of them is from, Carl is not a doctor, but Carl had a broken ankle. He broke his ankle on a vacation in Missouri, and they kept him overnight. It was a really severe break, put him in a cast. That night he felt like the Lord appeared to him and that he told him he was healed. Well, the next day the doctor came in and said, "You can just consult your doctor when you get back to Michigan." So his wife drove them back to Michigan. He consulted his doctor there, who ordered new x-rays, and a week later the doctor said to him, you don't have a broken ankle. In fact, these x-rays show you've never had a broken ankle. So he showed him the first radiology report, and he said, "Now that's a broken ankle." Joy Wanifred, she had vertical heterophoria. She had such a classic case of it that she was actually used in the pamphlet advertising the condition. She had a certified condition. By the way, if you notice the names are blocked out, I don't know what the laws are here in the UK, but in the US, I have the non-blocked out version, but in public, we're supposed to use the blocked out version. But anyway, she had a certified condition. She was at a prayer meeting at her university, and somebody prayed for her for this condition to be healed, and it was healed right there on the spot. And her doctor had to certify, for the sake of her driver's license, that she now had 20/20 vision. She could no longer wear glasses. I wish that would happen to me. But the doctor had never seen a case like this before, which, if it happened again, she wouldn't be able to say that. But the doctor said this is not a miracle, because the doctor didn't believe in miracles. And so, it depends on your starting assumptions. Your framework are going to make a difference in how you interpret the data, whether you call it an anomaly or a miracle. And so that's something that still needs to be addressed. The medical documentation itself doesn't resolve that question, but it does show us that something did happen. I'm going to give some other examples, and I'm just giving a sample of examples. But one principle that I'm following is that a smaller number of eyewitnesses should count more heavily than a greater number of skeptical non-witnesses. We would apply that in most other circumstances. If there's a traffic accident and the police officer is interviewing witnesses, and somebody comes along and says, that didn't happen. And the officer says, well, what did you see happen? And the person says, I didn't see anything happen. That's why I know nothing happened. Normally, we wouldn't weigh that as heavily as the reports of the eyewitnesses. So in some circles, like Hume's circle, Hume was not familiar with these things happening, but that doesn't mean that nobody's familiar with them in any circle. We have accounts, some of the early leaders of the church in their writings testified that they had witnessed these things firsthand. Augustine among them, he had thought that these things happened back in the past, but they barely ever happened in his day until he experienced one, and he had a friend with an anal fistula who needed to have another operation. They'd gotten some of them, they hadn't gotten the last one. And back then, people sometimes bled to death from operations, and they had no anesthesia. So the man was just wailing to God to heal him. Augustine was with him that night, went into surgery with him the next day, and the fistula was gone. And after that, his diocese started collecting affidavits from people who had been cured, and they had about 70 of them after 2 years. Wansuk Ma is the director for the Oxford Center of Mission Studies, which is a short walk from here, from St. Anne's. And Wansuk and Julie Ma prayed for someone who had a large goiter, and the goiter was instantly gone. Now, the reason that I'm giving this particular account and some other accounts like this is that, Hume said that you'll never have a credible eyewitness with something to lose who will testify of these things. Well, actually, we do have a number of credible eyewitnesses. That's why I mentioned so-and-so has a PhD or something like that, just to say we have a number of people like us who are educated people who are eyewitnesses and who do have something to lose. As Len pointed out, I do too, by taking on this subject. But Danny McCain was somebody I worked with for 3 summers in Nigeria, and when I was working on this book, I asked him if he had he'd seen anything. He said, well, actually, not in Nigeria, you may be surprised, but when I was growing up, my little brother, baby brother, had been burned all over his body. And we were having a prayer meeting. He'd been sent home from the hospital. They couldn't do anything, but suddenly he stopped crying, and I looked up and saw him crawling across the floor, and his skin had just become pink and new, like he'd never been burned. Something that I witnessed, along with my brother, who later went on for his PhD in physics. This was soon after I had become a Christian. I was helping out in a nursing home Bible study, And there was this lady there named Barbara who every week would say, "I wish I could walk, I wish I could walk." And the leader of the Bible study, one week he said, "I'm tired of this." And he walked over to her, grabbed her by the hand and said, "In the name of Jesus Christ, rise up and walk." He lifted her from her chair. And I could tell by the expression on her face she was totally horrified, which is what I was too, because I knew she was just going to fall flat on the ground. If faith is a bias, I cannot be accused of it in this case. He walked her around the room, and Barbara was looking like, what in the world is happening? From then on, Barbara could walk. And she would always say, "I love my Bible study." But I found about 350 reports of cured blindness, not all from equally credible sources. Some of them, though, were very strong. Rex Gardner reports eye scarring disappearing. Another case of a school teacher was blind after an accident. After his healing, he didn't even need glasses. Others have reported witnessing cataracts vanishing. A Methodist pastor that I know told me about a case. Actually, I was teaching on this in his church, and he told me about this case that he had witnessed, and this is the only picture he has of it. But there was a blind man in Tanzania who was, his eyes were completely white. He had to have people lead him to this meeting where this African preacher was preaching. And suddenly, after the African preacher had prayed for him, or actually like a few seconds after the African preacher had prayed for him, the man started shouting in Swahili and jumped up on the platform and started running around. And my friend was able to see him and to see his eyes were no longer white, and the man could see where he was running. And somebody explained to him what the Swahili meant, but he had already pretty much figured it out. In the year 2000, a friend of mine, Flint McLaughlin, he's director of Transforming Business Institute at Cambridge, prayed for a blind man in India with clouded eyes, and the man was instantly able to see. This is the field where he ran in circles praising God. This is where he was telling his story. I believe it was that same night, and the man began to weep. And one of the other people there who was a witness with whom I also spoke, said, they asked him, "Why are you weeping?" And he said, "Because I've always heard the sound of children, but I've never before seen their faces." Cameroonian Baptist Paul Mokaki was one of my students from a previous seminary where I taught. And he had told me a number of stories. He hadn't told me this one, because actually this happened after I had talked with him about it, about other things. But one of our other students was visiting and came back and said, "You'll never believe this. Paul prayed for this man who was blind and the man could see." So I asked Paul about it and he confirmed it. Dr. Banga Shabaku Kato, who's president of a university in Bunia, Congo DRC. Some years earlier, people brought to him and his colleagues a blind elderly woman who hadn't been helped by any other way and said, "Can you do something for him?" So he said, "Well, we've never done anything like this before," but they began to pray, and after about 2 minutes, she started shouting she could see, and she remained sighted for the rest of her life. Greg Spencer. This is a case where actually there was no prayer for healing taking place. But he had macular degeneration to the point of 2,400 in one eye and 2,200 in the other eye. And he was at a retreat praying for healing of the mind. And while he was praying for that, he opened his eyes, and suddenly he could see. And it got him in a little trouble because the Social Security Administration that was sending him checks said, "We need to investigate this for fraud because macular degeneration doesn't go away." But they said, after the investigation, "You're no longer disabled, you can no longer collect these checks." Accounts of resuscitations, which I like to go through some of these because they're not usually considered psychosomatic. But there are a number of these through history. We find them in the early church fathers. We find one in Wesley that probably means that. I have this picture here to remind me to tell you to, if you get queasy at the sight of blood, to close your eyes before the next slide. But this was from a neighbor of mine, and this is not his own experience, so this one is secondhand, but he put me in touch with this other person. And this one isn't much in my book because this happened after I moved to where I'm teaching now, but a friend of his was killed and had his neck cut. As you can see, actually the original scene was worse, but the body had been moved at this point, and was transported to the hospital. These pictures were taken from the evening news, and I did screenshots of them from the film from the news there in Indonesia. And he was taken to the hospital to be sent to the morgue, and he squeaked out, "I'm not dead." And they were really surprised, but they sewed back his neck, so he did require medical intervention. But he had a near-death experience, you can call it. He had an experience of heaven before he found himself conscious in his body. A number of accounts of this from Africa. Some have reported that it's fairly common in Ethiopia. I have a friend who says, "Nah, that might be an exaggeration," but they happen. I have another friend who gave me an account of that, but just moving quickly. Professor Ayo Adewuya, originally from Nigeria, teaches in the US at this point. But I was presenting this at a scholarly meeting, just saying, we need to take into account some of these global reports when we read the Gospels and Acts, so we can try to read them in a more multicultural setting. I mean, we tend to read them from a Western Humean perspective. So at the end of that, Professor Adewuya stood up and said, "My son was born dead. He was pronounced dead at his birth. We prayed for 30 minutes. He came back, and his son had no brain damage. He's now finished his Master of Science degree at the University of London." Another friend, one of the friends I worked with when I was in Nigeria for 3 summers, Leo Bawa, who last we talked was doing his PhD here in the UK. He was doing ministry in a village in northern Nigeria when his host's neighbors handed him their child, who, as far as anybody could tell, was dead. So he took the child aside, prayed for a few hours, and he said, "I came out of the room and handed over the boy to his parents alive." I asked Leo if he'd ever, if he just prayed for everybody who was dead. He said, "No, the only 2 times I ever did it was this time and for my best friend who died, and he didn't come back." I probably don't need to tell you this, but even in circles like this, most people who die stay dead, normally for a very long time. But there was another friend that I worked with there named Timothy Olanide, and this story is from a long time before I met him, and I didn't actually know about this story. I saw his scar, but I didn't know how he got it, and I didn't ask, and he didn't tell me. But some other people told me the story more recently, and so I contacted him and got more of the details. But he was among 3 people who were killed in a car accident, again, as far as anybody could tell. The police found no pulse or heartbeat. He was left at the mortuary from 6:30 p.m. until around 2 a.m. that morning. The mortuary worker discovered him moving. Well, the doctors at the hospital assumed that he had severe brain damage, but after 3 weeks, he was released from the hospital. He did have to be treated. He did require medical help. But his surgeon said this recovery is beyond medical explanation, and he's now an important leader in the Nigerian church. These examples are from Congo-Brazzaville, the smaller Congo where my wife is from. These are from Église Évangélique du Congo, which is the country's largest Protestant denomination. I'm sure the Catholics have more stories because they're a larger denomination, but these are the people that I was in touch with through my wife. And actually, Pastor Swami, the president of the denomination, had one of those accounts too. But all of these are people that my wife's family knows very well. Jean Mabiala is a deacon in the Evangelical Church of Congo, and she had more than one account. One of the accounts, she was trained as a midwife by the World Health Organization. It was during the war, and a baby was born dead with the umbilical cord wrapped around its neck. It had already turned gray, probably died in the night in its mother's womb. While the father was out building a coffin, she and some other people there began to pray, and the child came back to life. And the child was named Mille Grâce, a thousandfold grace. She's now in school. Albert Bisweswe was working as a school inspector in the north of Congo a number of years ago. And by the way, again, this is not somebody who has lots and lots of stories. This is his only account of this happening, but it's the only time he ever prayed for it either. There was a dead girl, and a crowd gathered around her. And they were asking, they asked him to pray because they'd taken her to traditional healers and, to a number of different ones. They'd offered sacrifices. They'd smeared the blood in her mouth, nose, eyes, and ears, so that if she wasn't dead beforehand, she probably was dead afterwards. But this had been going on for about 8 hours by the time they brought the child to him. And so he prayed for about half an hour, he said, and the child was restored. And people were so impressed that the next time a child died in the village, they came and asked his wife they wanted to get him to pray, but he was out of town, so they asked his wife, and she prayed, and the same thing happened. But again, those are the only two accounts that they have from their life was in that village. The account of Therese Magnuha, though, was the one who really got my attention. I'd heard this story before I interviewed the witness, but I didn't know the details. Therese was about 2 years old when she cried out that she was bitten by a snake. When her mother got to her, she found that she was not breathing, again, as far as anybody could tell. There was no medical help in the village, so she strapped the child to her back and ran to a nearby village where a family friend, Coco Ngoma Moise, was doing ministry. And she asked him to pray. And the child, I asked, she said, no, the child still wasn't breathing. I said, how long was that? She had to stop and think to get from one village to the next. And she said, about 3 hours. Well, Therese started breathing when Coco Moise prayed for her. The next day she was fine. Since then, she's finished her master's degree in Cameroon and become a pastor back in Congo. And this one really got my attention to be more open to some of the other ones because Therese is my sister-in-law and Antoinette Malambe is my mother-in-law, and this lovely one here is my wife. We have a number of claims from India. There was a people movement. A vast number of people became Christians from an area where there were apparently no Christians. This one is spoken of in a dissertation on how this people movement began. It started with a government official's son who was very sick and was dying. And he had tried sacrificing, he tried the different medicines, which normally, on Len's advice, I've taken some medicine. It seems to be helping me now. But in this case, nothing was helping. And the pharmacist said, well, you've tried everything else. Why don't you pray to Jesus, the Christian God? Because it said he raised somebody named Lazarus from the dead. So he thought he could try it. He prayed. His son, by this point, as far as they could tell, he was dead. He said, if you raise my son from the dead, like you did with Jesus, like you did with Lazarus, I will follow you. And his son revived, and he and many of the people became followers of Jesus at that point. Two Western sociologists were studying Indian Pentecostalism and in some other places. They interviewed local people, including Hindu witnesses, of people who had been dead as far as anybody could tell. In one case, the worms were coming out of the girl's nose. And they said, this is the report we got from the witnesses, not just from Christians, but from others there of these things happening. A pastor in Mumbai shared with me, his church was at a retreat center, and believers found a Hindu boy named Vikram lying at the bottom of a pool there. And they tried to revive him, they couldn't. So two of them went, while the others stayed behind. Two of them went to a hospital. One doctor said, there's nothing I can do, the boy's dead. They took him to another doctor. This doctor tried to revive him but couldn't, said he's dead. But about an hour and a half later, as they were coming back, the boy revived. And he said he'd heard the name Jesus and then was rescued. His parents noted that he'd never heard this name before, and this is Vikram. By the way, these pictures are Vikram after he came back. And so this is Vikram and his family joining in the Christians in their worship service. I think I'll skip some of these. Deborah Watson was my colleague at the seminary where I taught before, my current seminary, Faculty of Theology. And Deborah she did her PhD at Durham and is a fellow New Testament person. But Debbie told me about an account from her childhood. And she had me get the details from her parents, who would have a clearer memory of it. But her sister fell from a high-perched bassinet. Her baby sister fell from a high-perched bassinet. Not only did they think she was dead, they thought the back of her skull was crushed. It felt like it was crushed. And they were praying as they rushed her to the nearest medical help that they could find. And when they took her in, she was, the doctor said, "Come in here. You said the back of her skull was crushed. Feel this." And she was fine. And this is a picture over here. It's not because she's very short. I think she's kneeling anyway. But Chauncey Crandall is a cardiologist, and he was making his rounds in the hospital, I think on a Saturday, when Jeff Markin had checked himself into the hospital because of chest pains, collapsed in the emergency room. They were trying to revive him for about 40 minutes using all the American Heart Association's protocols, and they finally called Dr. Crandall in to just certify the obvious as a cardiologist. And so he pronounced him dead. He was returning to his rounds, and he felt like God wanted him to go back and pray for this man. And so he went back and he prayed for the man out loud, and the nurse was looking at him like, "You've lost your mind." And he turned to his colleague who'd come back in with him and asked him to shock him with a paddle one more time. And his colleague said, "That's not going to do anything, but if you want me to do it, I'll do it." He shocked him one time, and immediately he had a normal heartbeat. And even though Markin's extremities had already turned black, he recovered fully. And I've talked with Dr. Crandall more about this since then. Now, you could say, well, this one was a coincidence, this one was a coincidence, and some of them might be explained that way. I mean, maybe people just were thought to be dead, whatever the case. But when you have clusters of these in particular circles, I went back and found that there were about 10 people that I knew. Not everybody I mentioned was among them, but there were about 10 people that I knew who had eyewitness accounts of this kind of thing happening. And whatever the probability of it as a coincidence is for one case, if you've got 10 cases in your immediate circle, I hope you can excuse me from, I hope you won't mind me thinking that special divine action might be a legitimate explanation, or if not, at least that I can read the Gospels as plausible accounts. I don't know if I have time for nature miracles. I know we started late, but okay. I'm just going to give a couple examples of these. Now again, these are not considered psychosomatic, but Emmanuel Thompson was my colleague at the seminary where I taught before. Emmanuel is from Nigeria. He grew up in a family where his father was starting churches in unchurched areas, and his father was starting a church. Emmanuel was a boy at the time. He was there with him. He was starting a church in this one village, and he was just putting a roof on his home that he was moving into there, but he didn't have the roof on yet. Rainy season was starting, and people were making fun of him and saying, "Ha, you're going to get drenched. Everything you have is going to be ruined." And Emmanuel's father got angry and said, "It's not going to rain one drop of rain in this village until I have this roof on my house," which was going to take about 4 more days. And the people laughed and left. And he fell on his face and said, "Oh God, what have I done?" But for the next 4 days, in this village, it didn't rain at all in the village, even though it was raining all around the village. And at the end of those 4 days, the people in this region who knew what rainy season was supposed to look like in their region, only one person in that village had not become a Christian. And they still talk about that as the time when this became a predominantly Christian village. Have any of you heard of Watchman Nee? John Sung is really more known for this in Chinese, modern Chinese history, but Watchman Nee, he didn't have a whole lot of stories like this, but he had this one from his younger days, that they were out doing evangelism in a village, and people were making fun of them, saying, well, look, for about 200 years, we've always scheduled, whenever the priests schedule the festival of our God, it never rains on that day. And so our God is really powerful. And why would we listen to you talking about your God? Well, one of the members of the team said, well, on this year, on that day, it's not going to rain. And they laughed at him. He went back and told the rest of the team. And they said, that was foolish. You shouldn't have done that. Because if it doesn't rain on that day, nobody's going to listen to us. But nobody was listening to them anyway. So they began to pray. It poured down rain on that day. The priests rescheduled the festival, and the next time it was supposed to, the next time they'd rescheduled it for, this time the Christians had gone out and said, it's going to rain on that day too. And it poured down rain on that day, and it's, I think I'll skip the next story. I have others, but I think I've probably said enough. So my point in all this, even though in the book I also talk about special divine action, the main point I want to make is that the analogy argument against Jesus' healings, it was limited in value in earlier history, but it's no longer a plausible argument in its current form. However we explain them, people do experience healings and some other kinds of anomalies in theistic contexts, and sometimes even clusters of those in theistic contexts. So.
And what does a philosopher say to that? There's a tension in Hume's famous essay, right there in the text. On the one hand, he dismisses a report of a man thoroughly dead rising from the dead because he says that this has never been seen in any time or country. A few pages on, where it's convenient to be talking about knavery, folly, and the love of wonder, he says, well, every age and country has abounded with miracle reports. I really would like to know which way it's supposed to be. I don't have Hume here to ask, but somehow after this presentation, I don't think I need to. So, which way is it? Well, already we've had someone raise at this conference the question of religious context. Does it help or does it hurt? And I think the only thing I can sensibly say is it depends, and it depends on things that philosophers are not specially privileged to inquire into. Take the negative side of it. Where better for scoundrels to prey upon the devotion of the religious, right? That's a perfect place. If somebody wants to pull off a scam, go to somewhere where people are already emotionally worked up and tell them you can heal them and see what drops out of their pockets along the way. Sure, I get that. I have a reasonable amount of cynicism. No doubt many of you do as well. On the other hand, if there were a God, in what sort of context might one expect divine action, special divine action? A religious context or a non-religious one? Huxley famously said he wouldn't believe the testimony of witnesses to a miracle, for example, if 12 good Englishmen told him that they'd seen a centaur trotting down Piccadilly. he wouldn't believe them. And why would God create a centaur and send him down Piccadilly? So it seems to me that there are considerations that pull both ways here. And there's absolutely no a priori consideration that we can invoke to say this one trumps that one. Everything is a matter of the evidence. And it's interesting that you raised this issue, this methodological principle that you were using of taking positive evidence to be of more weight than negative evidence. This is a well-known principle in law. When we're talking about witness testimony, you can have witnesses otherwise adequately situated, but the testimony generally of a witness who says that something did occur will be preferred over that of one who did not. This is a principle of Anglo-American jurisprudence. This is not something specially devised by Christian apologists in order to gin up their claims. And the reason is that it's been discovered in a wide range of cases that there are more ways to miss something than they are to be mistaken about your positive belief that you see it. Inadvertence, you were looking the other way, you were focused on something else at the moment, you forgot that you had stepped out. Lots of different ways for that to happen. So I think the principle in general is a sound one, and it has more than merely special pleading to back it up. And I can give you references because I know you like it. I was joking that this is the shortest thing from Craig Keener that you'll ever read, and you'll notice that half of it is references. I love you, Craig. Just had to say. One of the complaints historically made, not just by Hume, but by people like Rousseau in his Savoyard Vicar, is why is it that there are always men between me and God? Why is it I always have to take someone else's word for it? And I will freely confess, to the best of my knowledge, I've never seen anything that I would call a miracle. After listening to Craig, I'm wondering if maybe I need to get out more. With so much from Craig's paper to say, I guess I'll just close by paraphrasing something that David Johnson says at the end of his book, Hume, Holism and Miracles. He says, there's a sort of humble conclusion to his examination of Hume's argument. He says, we philosophers, nothing of interest to say when, in our reading, we chance upon a miracle, health restored or a life renewed, the shining angels, or the women weeping.
Well, we've got plenty of time for Q&A. I'm apologetic that I don't know everyone's name, but I think we can certainly learn from both of these, the paper and the commentary, how careful philosophers should be about contesting the minor premise. Philosophers should stick to the major premise and leave the minor premise to observation, report, controlled experimentation, etc. Yes, sir. Yes?
Got to pass the microphone around here. It's coming.
Gentleman in the light blue shirt.
I'm very grateful to Craig for his paper, and I'm very interested in the data that he puts before us. I'm interested in the question why people are resistant to miracle reports and why they're skeptical about them. And with your permission, I'd like to be a little bit autobiographical about one of the sources of resistance that I have. And I should say that I'm a Christian and I see no principled reason at all why there shouldn't be miracles. So I'm not against them in principle. Indeed, I think it'd be rather good if they happened. In fact, I think they probably do happen sometimes, but here's something that happens. About 18 years ago, I was cycling my 2-year-old daughter along the road to the hospital while my wife went in a taxi to get a scan. My wife was pregnant, and what the scan was for was to work out whether the baby that she was carrying, our baby, was dead or alive. And whilst I cycled, I can promise you that I prayed very hard, and the baby was in fact dead. And you don't forget something like that easily. Now, the thing about miracles is, of course, I'm pretty unhappy about the fact that no miracle happened there, that prayer of mine was not answered. But I can understand people who want to exclude miracles altogether in the following way, because it kind of gets your hopes up. And we have this life to live, and we have to face death and suffering, and if you're constantly thinking, well, this time it might not happen, this time there might be this way out, you feel like you're dieting yourself on crazy hopes, which actually make it harder, e.g. to get on with the business of mourning your lost daughter.
Before you give up the microphone, I should have reminded everyone to say your name. I think it'll help with the records. Say your name and where you're from.
Timothy Chappell.
Thank you. Who's up? Who's shy?
Oh, great.
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you for sharing that, Timothy. Actually, my wife and I have had seven miscarriages, so I understand it's not. And we were praying, and miracles didn't happen on those occasions. But I think the way we often look at miracles, well, if I can step back, I know this is more of a philosophical conference, but if I can step back as a New Testament scholar and just say how I understand them in the Gospels. In Matthew 11 and Luke 7, John the Baptist is saying, are you the expected one, or should we look for somebody else? I trust you'll tell me the truth, but John was facing execution, and he wanted to know what was happening, because he'd received reports that Jesus was healing the sick, but John's prophecy was Jesus was going to baptize in fire, and so it didn't seem to fit. And the answer that Jesus gives seems to evoke especially two texts in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah 35 and Isaiah 61. And those texts are about the restoration of God's people, and ultimately, in the context, the restoration of all of creation. And it seems that with that, and also when Jesus says, if I, by the Spirit of God, in Matthew 12, or in Luke 11, if I, by the finger of God, am driving out demons, then the kingdom of God has come upon you, or God's expected reign has come upon you. There's questions about exactly how to translate that, but the overall sense seems to be that Jesus' miracles were meant to be understood as signs of the kingdom, that is as of a foretaste of a world when there'll be no more pain, when every tear is wiped away from our eyes, and death will be no more, and creation will be restored, and so on. It's a foretaste, and so even though it doesn't happen to all of us, when it does happen to anyone, it's a gift to all of us, because it's a reminder of hope, of a better world to come. And that hope can give us strength. I know in these cases that I just mentioned, and in sometimes just the way we do scholarship in New Testament, we're kind of trained to use skepticism as far as we can take it, and if anything's left standing, we'll accept it. And so I'm influenced by those things, but the hope, these other things give me hope. And my wife was a refugee for 18 months in Congo during the war, and I have a close friend who became an agnostic because of suffering in the world. And I understand where he's coming from, but but I asked my wife what she thought about it, and she said, if I hadn't had hope in God, I couldn't have kept going. And so it gives a real, well, I believe it gives a real transcendent hope.
Tiny comeback. I agree with you that the hope can make it easier to go on. But my worry is that sometimes the hope actually makes it harder to go on, not easier.
I would just add very briefly that science and nature and hope itself can also breed false hopes. They don't, that's not a monopoly of religion. This gentleman over here.
Actually, Len, could I just say
Oh, please. Sorry, Tim.
just one word in response to that, and I'll try to keep this very brief because I know everybody wants to hear Craig more than me. I was reminded, as you were speaking, of the situation of David after Bathsheba's child was born. And the child was very sickly, and David prostrated himself and was fasting and weeping and praying and asking for the child's life, even though he'd been told the child would die. And when the child finally did die, the servants were too afraid to come and tell him because they could tell how wrought he was. And if you'll recall, David noticed them loitering outside, and he rose and he said, "Is the child dead?" And they said, "Yes." And then he washed his face and began to eat. He said, he cannot come to me, I must go to him. And there's something in that attitude of petition where you realize that the answer may well be no. I don't think that we're enjoined to expect the miraculous. We may ask for it, but we have to be prepared to give David's answer as well. That's not an easy thing for anybody to absorb, but it struck me that example is there. So go on then.
Please. David Kyle Johnson, King's College, Pennsylvania, not London, Pennsylvania. Excuse me. So it seems to me, I enjoyed your talk. It seems to me that your thesis is right, that these stories provide some evidence for thinking that the Jesus stories are historical, right? They're not just myth, right? But that thesis also lends to other conclusions, right? As I'm sure you know, there were a plethora of other miracle workers at the time of Jesus who also, there are reports, who performed miracles, et cetera, right? So if it follows from your thesis that Jesus' stories are historical, well then so are theirs, right? And so then you end up having just as much reason for thinking that they were miracle workers as Jesus, and presumably they weren't actually working with God's power. And so then what's going on there? Do you dismiss those and say that those are like, you can debunk those and say, well, those didn't, people thought they were miracles, but they weren't? Or do you say that God really was working through them? And then you end up with, you don't get the conclusion that you want, which is we have evidence for Jesus' divinity, but not for these other people. In the same vein, I'm sure you know that you could go through, the examples that you have are all examples of people who prayed to Jesus or who were converted to Christianity and that kind of stuff after these miracles. But of course, you could go to other religions and find, of course, in Judaism and Islam, and also outside of monotheistic religions, you could find stories that are just as convincing, that have nothing to do with Christianity at all. So what do you say? Do you say, well, do you debunk those? Do you explain those away and say those didn't really happen? Or do you say they really did happen? And if you do say that, what do you say? Do you say that, well, Jesus is actually working through them even though they're not invoking Jesus' name? Or I'm curious about what you say about these kinds of miracles that would be outside of Christianity entirely, and do you debunk them? Do you dismiss them? What do you say?
You were very fluent because I didn't even get all the questions down. But anyway, but I will. I'll if I miss something, feel free to remind me. But I'm actually not answering Hume's argument from competing religions, because I actually don't think it's a good argument. Because I don't think God just hears the prayers of Christians, for one thing. But also, so I think God also could work through other people. And also, in terms of seeing the miracles as evidence for Jesus' divinity, that could be a Johannine approach. But in the Synoptics, it's more evidence for the impending kingdom, which isn't really how other people normally used it. I'm sorry, I'm lapsing into New Testament scholar stuff. But anyway, But there's also there's also been some studies done of some of the other miracle worker claims from antiquity. Now, of course, there are miracle worker claims around the world today, and it's not limited to Christianity. It does appear more in some kinds of circles than in others, and more in some religions than in others. But in any case, in antiquity, the closest parallels we have for Jesus, in fact, some of the things, they sound very close, although not all of them, are with Philostratus's accounts of Apollonius of Tyana. But Apollonius of Tyana actually was sometime after Jesus. He probably died in the reign of, actually, I was going to say he died in the reign of Domitian, but actually, according to Philostratus, he doesn't actually do that. But anyway, but Philostratus is writing in the 3rd century, I believe. So he's writing, he's not writing like a generation later, say like Mark, where Mark has about 1/3 of his narrative, or about 1/2 of his narrative before the Passion narrative consists of miracle stories. At the time that Philostratus is writing, the Christian stories were widespread. And so when people talk about which direction did the influence go, it seems to me that the influence would be more likely to go from the stories about Jesus to influence Philostratus than the reverse. But we do have other accounts of miracle workers, certainly. Some have argued for the late dates of some of those, but ultimately I do believe that there were other people doing some of it. In fact, the Gospels talks about, and in the book of Acts talks about some other people doing some of those things. So I wasn't making an argument for Christology based on this. That's not to say that somebody can't make an argument for Christology based on it, but I don't think you would make that argument based solely on the miracles. Otherwise, you'd be in trouble when you get to the book of Acts.
Who's up? Who's next? Yes, in the back. Yes. Wait for the mic.
Thank you. I'm Jonathan Hill from Exeter University, and that was a fantastic talk, so thank you very much. I should say that as a non-believer in miracles, you haven't convinced me that there is divine action, but I think that your argument that reports of this kind undermine the analogy argument is quite right, actually, and I think that is a particular argument against New Testament miracles that doesn't really work. But I wanted to just pick up on a small point that Professor McGrew made in the response about positive testimony versus negative testimony. And you said that someone who says, I did see it, gets more evidential weight than someone who says, I didn't see it, it didn't happen, because it's easier to miss something than to think you've seen something that didn't happen. And I just wonder, at this point, whether that actually cuts both ways. Because couldn't you say that a miracle report, although in a sense it's someone describing something they've seen, if you were cynical, you could say it's someone missing something. It's someone not noticing that the guy still had a pulse and actually wasn't dead, or not noticing that there was an explanation for whatever. And so, could that, if you're going to take that seriously, could that weaken the argument that genuinely miraculous things happen?
I think that's for Tim. You both can have a
I'll say
shot
something brief, but I'll then turn it over to Craig. Sure, I think that it can, and I think that everything depends on the details of the case. And so in some of these cases, Craig's been very candid with us in saying, look, as far as they could tell, this is how it seemed to them. It seemed like the child wasn't breathing, seemed like there was no pulse, etc. And in some cases, where there's not a medical team on hand to provide you the documentation, that's the best that you can do. So sure, there's always that possibility. And I think that it's healthy to keep that in mind. Nobody wants to be duped, really. There may be people who devoutly want something to happen, but nobody wants just to be deceived for the sake of being deceived. So I think that's salutary, and all I would say is if we're somewhat cynical or somewhat skeptical, let's hold on to that, but let's not elevate that, like Hume seems to have done, to the level of a methodological principle.
Greg, you want to add something?
Yeah, I can add something, although
Go.
what Tim said was more effective. But there are, in terms of being witnesses and not being witnesses, most of these kinds of things I've never seen myself. I've never seen somebody who was, as far as I could tell, dead and then came back to life. I've never seen cataracts disappear. I mentioned that I saw the person, being able to walk after he said, "Rise up and walk." But I can think of explanations I could give for that, even though it didn't seem like she had any confidence it would work. But in any case, but the people. Well, I've seen a few things, and the people that I know and trust, there are enough of those where I have confidence. But at the same time, whether the pulse was there or something, I know that they wouldn't intentionally deceive, but I can't prove that they would have necessarily been right about the pulse or whatever. Interpretation, whatever the evidence, you still need interpretation. So the framework in which you interpret it is going to be important. So I don't think even just having the miracle reports by themselves will convince somebody who's convinced that they can't be interpreted that way. And sometimes there are people who will be too ready to accept reports without critically evaluating them. So, yeah, I just think there needs to be a broader context, not just the reports.
This lady here, if we can come down.
I'm Bethany Solleretter, also from Exeter University. My question is simply, how do you decide which framework to use? I mean, as a historian, you're looking at these things. How do you decide if we use the framework of saying special divine action or using the framework of saying placebo effect and not noticing this and psychosomatic when we have two competing things? Graham Twelfthtree, for example, gave us those three. Do you have a similar list?
I liked when it was said that Graham's list was meant to be supplemental. That is, these aren't sufficient conditions, but these are necessary conditions. So I just try to look at the evidence and weigh the evidence because my training is more as a historian. So I look at the historical evidence, and in the case of like the accounts that I gave, I try to see how credible the witnesses are. I try to see what other explanations are possible, what other explanations are plausible. And what I come to ultimately is I think that from a theistic framework, the evidence is very compelling. If I were an atheist at this point, which I used to be, and I looked at the evidence, I think it would give me pause. But it wouldn't necessarily compel me to become a theist. There has to be more to it than that.
We've got time for one or possibly two more questions. Yes, sir.
I really appreciated the many, many cases that you told us about. And I wanted neither to be skeptical or unskeptical, except in the best sense, but to see to what extent it's possible to introduce an additional degree of methodological rigor in the following way, that with any human endeavor, there's going to be uncertainties, there's going to be mistakes made, there's going to be misreporting, and so on and so forth. And I was wondering to what extent you're able to find benchmarks of that from other fields of epidemiological study, and to say that if you look at reports, of cases that are not in the context of any particular prayer as far as is known or any believing community, but just where misdiagnoses occurs and diagnoses have to be changed and reports have to be corrected. Is it possible to get some benchmarks of those against which you could assess these, particularly in the light of your comments that you're saying, you know, you recognize that some of these reports may be more reliable than others and so on?
Yeah, misdiagnosis, fraud, coincidence. I mean, there are a lot of different possible explanations for different kinds of reports. I can't give a statistical response, but where I found statistics, the level of misdiagnosis would have to be so high that I would be scared about our medical system, although some people are scared about it anyway. But I don't think the level of misdiagnosis would be high enough to account for some of the things that I found, and also for remissions. I didn't deal with remissions because I know there's an easy answer that, you know, remissions occur outside of religious context as well. And that actually people revive sometimes that we think are dead outside of religious context as well. But while I couldn't find statistics on how often people revive that we think are dead, from everything I could see, if I took a hypothetical number, say like if one out of I think it was 1 out of 10 people you would expect to have in their circle somebody who had an eyewitness account of somebody coming back after being pronounced dead. If it's much higher than that, then we're burying a lot of people prematurely. So I just took that as a number. I thought it was a very generous estimate, you know, that usually you wouldn't expect more than that. But that if, given that, I would find 10 people in my immediate circle, or actually even more than that, because one of them had multiple accounts, then my estimate was it would probably be somewhere in the, like, 1 chance in several billion. For the
if I can chip in, what I'm
coincidences.
trying to do is to shift this from the speculative to the objective. So we do know the numbers of wrong legs that are amputated. Okay, it shouldn't ever happen. There's no excuse for it, but it does happen, and there are facts, and the statistics can be found out. And it's not a question of sitting around the fireside and saying, well, I wonder how many times the wrong leg is amputated. You can actually find it out. And I agree that these cases are harder than that, but I would have thought not impossible to find some benchmarks for.
I found it as I found statistics for how often remissions occur, and if those statistics are accurate, which I kind of question but anyway, if they're accurate, then it was something like 1 in 100,000 cases or 1 in 80,000 cases. I actually found different estimates of that. If those are really accurate, then we have a whole lot more people reporting being healed miraculously in particular circles than we would expect. I don't know if those statistics are accurate. And as for the some of the other stuff, one of the things I said up front in the book was I explored anthropology, I explored the other disciplines, and I tried to be consistent with the methodology used in anthropological observations and so on. But the one thing I didn't want to step into in the book was I wanted to leave the medical documentation for others. I have a physician, a doctor who is hoping also to do a PhD in theology, and this is probably going to be his dissertation topic, dealing with the medical documentation for miracles. And so this is something good for me to keep in mind to talk with him about. But I felt I was kind of stretching beyond my expertise even to do what I did with philosophy of science in the book.
Well, we are stretching a little. 2 quick points. One is that the idea of skepticism has been biased historically. we're supposed to be skeptical about religious claims, for example. We're not supposed to be skeptical about denial of religious claims. That's a bias that we have to watch out for. The other thing that we should remember, and I think it's a wonderful take-home from Craig's beautiful paper, is that his main thesis was that being a priori skeptical about gospel reports or other ancient or biblical reports, that's a problem, because the kind of evidence that he has presented for us, no matter how we interpret it, is really a matter not of legend at all. These are immediate, these are direct, these are documented. This is not the kind of thing that grows up by word of mouth, by a kind of game of telephone from one person to the next. Let's thank our two wonderful speakers.